Honor to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I think maybe I'll start by quoting the president that you and I both worked for and just say, well, David, there you go again. I'm a great admirer of David Stockman, and I was telling David that I think his book, The Triumph of Politics, is one of the most important political science books of all time. And everyone should, even, let's say you wrote that, 39 years ago or something like that. It's hard to believe. It really does summarize the dysfunction in Washington that David talked about. And look, I agree with probably, 70% of what David just said. So I don't think there's a huge difference in our view of the world, but I'm here to defend Donald Trump. I served as Trump economic advisor in 2016. Oh, and by the way, one of your great accomplishments among many, David, was hiring my buddy and the best man at my wedding, Larry Kudlow, as your chief economist. So I want to kind of talk about what Trump did in his first term, why he did it, why I think it matters a lot. I'll start by saying that I couldn't agree more that I think that this $35 trillion debt is a cancer cell in the American economy. And I can't say whether it's going to be 3 weeks from now or 3 months from now or 3 years from now. But if we stay on the current course, David Stockman is right. We will have a financial crisis that will be extraordinarily painful. So we have to do something about this debt before we get, you want to steer the Titanic away from the iceberg before it hits it. And that's why, what you've been saying about the debt is so important. But it's also true that, my kind of joke about David Stockman is he has predicted 8 of the last 3 recessions. So you've been Mr. Doom and Gloom for a long time. And I want to say something about the Reagan years, because I think this is really important. It's really formulated my thoughts about the economy. I think you underappreciate what we accomplished and what you accomplished in the 1980s. I lived through the 1970s. I remember, the 12% inflation and the 17% mortgage interest rates, and our American economy was in the trash can. And Reagan saved the economy. He saved the American economy. And he also won the Cold War without firing a shot, which is pretty cool when you think about it. And the reason I mention that is because one thing that frustrates me about David Stockman is I feel like you don't appreciate actually what you accomplished. The fact is that when Reagan came into office, the highest income tax rate in the United States was 70%. The highest corporate tax rate was 50%. We were not competitive. And Reagan, thanks to people like Art Laffer, realized that there is a Laffer curve effect. And the Laffer curve is very simple. It simply says if you tax something, you get less of it, right? We all know that. If you tax something, you get less of it. And if you tax something less, you get more of it. Now, we could argue about whether you're going to raise more revenue from a tax cut and so on. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. But the fact is that our tax rates were way, way too high. And there was no way we could prosper as a nation with those rates. And one of the greatest accomplishments of my lifetime in policy was that when Reagan entered office, our highest tax rate was 70%. And when Reagan left office, the highest tax rate in the United States was 28%. That's an amazing achievement when you think about it. And the incentives for investment, for saving, for growth, for work were dramatically improved. Instead of being able to keep 30 cents on the dollar at a 70% tax rate, you were able to keep 72 cents on the dollar. So the incentive to invest and to save and to create a business was double. And so it's no surprise that we saw the boom in the American economy. And one of the things that I disagree with David about is, yes, the debt is a staggering number, and it is very, very frightening to all of us. However, it's important to realize that borrowing in and of itself, and I'd love to hear David's response to this, borrowing in and of itself is not a bad thing. It really depends on what you're borrowing for. And I would make the case that, and by the way, isn't it ironic, David, that we were sweating over $100 billion deficits, 40 years ago, and here we are today with a $2 trillion deficit. So it's sickening what's going on in Washington today. We're on an order of magnitude higher deficits today than back when David Stockman was OMB director. But what did we borrow for in the 1980s? We borrowed to fund that tax cut to rebuild the American economy. And we borrowed to have one of the biggest buildups in our military I guess since the World War II. And what's the old saying? That Reagan won the Cold War without firing a shot. And one of the things to think about is when you think about all that money that we spent, and maybe and I agree with David, we probably wasted a lot of money on the Pentagon, and you talk a lot about that in your book. But the truth is that what is the discounted present value to society, to young people? I see some young people in this room, to not having an evil empire, to not having the Soviet Union. I would say the benefit to that is in the tens and tens of trillions of dollars. I mean, remember in the late 1970s and early 1980s, one of the greatest, if you asked Americans, what are you most worried about? Obviously, it was inflation and low growth. But the single biggest worry of Americans at that time was global thermonuclear war, because of the tension between these crazy people in the Kremlin and the United States. And so by winning the Cold War, that was gigantic achievement for our country that we will, for decades and decades and decades, continue to feel the dividends of. And the other thing, we built the economy. And so I think those were good investments, and I think they were worth borrowing for. The other thing to think about is the period 1980 to about 2005, that's about a 25-year period, was the greatest period of wealth creation in the history of civilization. No country has seen anything like what's happened in the United States. One of my favorite statistics is that when, you may remember this, David, in the summer of 1982, the Dow Jones Industrial Average hit 800. 800. Think about that. And what is the Dow Jones Industrial Average today? 40,000. So think about yes, the debt is a big problem, but the wealth of the American people has increased by the tens and tens of trillions of dollars. Now, I'm not saying we can afford this debt. I'm just saying you have to look at the debt relative to our incomes and ability to repay it. And when you look at it from that standpoint, it's not quite as daunting. It is daunting, and David's right about that, but it's not quite as daunting. One of my fundamental things that I always have told Donald Trump and members of Congress and senators and governors is, and I'd love to hear, again, David's response on this. Growth is everything. And I know David's going to flinch when I say this, but we can grow our way out of this deficit and the debt. We can grow our way out of this debt. If you look at those charts, those numbers that you were reciting, David, and those are accurate. If you look at the forecast by the Congressional Budget Office, which is what those numbers are based on, they are forecasting 1.7% growth for the American economy over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And to that I say, hell no, we're America. We're not going to grow at 1.7%. We're going to do everything possible in a second Trump term to grow the economy at almost double that pace. I think we can get the growth rate up to 3.25%. That's been the path of the American economy since post-World War II. Set our aspirations high. Now, we could have an argument about whether that's achievable or not, and that's a good argument to have, but it's a good aspiration. And I'm going to tell you this. First of all, without more economic growth, David, it doesn't matter how much you raise taxes, how much we cut spending, you're not going to make much progress on the debt. You've got to get the economy growing because that's what generates the revenues in the economy. And the second point I would make related to this, that if we were to get to, if you look at the curve on the debt, and I think we'd agree that you want to look at the debt as a share of our GDP. Is that a fair, assessment? So David's right. I mean, those numbers are just frightening. They just go straight up like a rocket ship. But if you put 3 to 3.25% growth in that, guess what? It starts to bend down. And it down. So growth, I think, is critical, and that's something that I've told Trump. Now, I think I've got, how much more time have I got left? About 5 minutes or so. Okay. So let me just spend my remaining time talking about the Trump tax cut, because I take this personally, because with Larry Kudlow and with Kevin Hassett and a couple of others, we kind of designed the first idea of the Trump tax cut. And if I may, I'll just walk you through some of the kind of gems of that tax bill, because I'm proud of it. And I think one of the things that I disagree with David about is, you said, well, it's going to cost X, I don't even remember the number, over the next 10 years. Wait a minute. The people, if you look at what the projection was for federal tax revenues before we passed the Trump tax bill. In other words, here's what CBO said would be tax revenues without the Trump tax cut. And then you look at what happened with the Trump tax cut, we're actually higher. Our revenues are higher today than they were without the Trump tax cut. In other words, you could make a strong case that those tax cuts did pay for themselves. Now, what did we do? What were the fundamental elements of that tax cut? First and foremost, the crown jewel of that tax cut was reducing the federal corporate tax rate, the tax rate that we impose on American businesses. And I remember showing Trump a chart of, we're up here, the rest of the world's down here. And Trump said it very well. He said, this is like putting a tariff on our own goods and services. What country does that? It's economic masochism. We're up here and the rest of the world's down here. That doesn't work, right? It just doesn't work. We're putting on the United States, our average rate was 40%, theirs was 20%. And all the other countries in the world were down, 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 down. They kept cutting their tax rates. Why? Why were they doing that? The reason they were doing that was they were trying to steal jobs and businesses and manufacturing from the United States. They're trying to rob us. By the way, the country that has the highest growth rate in all of Europe today is Ireland. Ireland has the lowest corporate tax rate at 12.5%, and they're just soaking in capital. So tax rates really do have a big impact on where money is invested. So we cut that rate from 40% down to about 25%, and that had a huge impact. We brought in about $1 trillion of capital as a result of that tax bill. Second of all, we doubled the standard deduction. Now, that's a big loss to revenue when you double the standard deduction, but I'm a big believer in the flat tax. In fact, you talk about the flat tax, I think, in your book about how George Shultz had this idea of, I like the idea of get rid of all the deductions, lower the rates. Well, we did some of that, but one of the things we did by simplifying the tax system is by doubling the standard deduction. Prior to that, about 35 to 40% of Americans had to itemize their deductions. They had to keep the shoe boxes full of all the receipts and blah, blah, blah. And it was a complicated thing for people. Now you just check the box and you're done. That was probably the single biggest simplification of our tax system ever to do that. Do we really want to go back to people having to itemize all these stupid deductions? By the way, there's only 9% of Americans today, David, you may know this, only 9% of Americans itemize their deductions. You know who they are? Really, really, really rich people. So, maybe you and I could agree, why don't we just get rid of all the deductions at this point? You want to make the tax code simple? You want to soak the rich? Let's get rid of every single remaining deduction. The homeowner, right? Let's just get rid of it. So the next thing we did, which was huge in terms of making the tax code, quote, fairer. And you all, I know I'm talking to a New York audience, so you're not going to want to hear this, but this is something that, I really pressed. Let's get rid of the state and local tax deduction because it's unfair. Why should people in Florida and Texas, Tennessee pay more taxes for, people who live in New York and my home state of Illinois and California? So the more by doing that, it just shifted the tax burden away from the blue states. And by the way, that was all millionaires and billionaires that were taking the big deductions from that. So that was huge. By the way, Trump should have said this in the debate. Kamala Harris is proposing, by getting rid of the Trump tax cut, the biggest tax cut in the history of the United States for millionaires and billionaires by bringing back the state and local tax deduction. The other thing we did was we got rid of the evil alternative minimum tax. Remember that? That was something that prior to that tax cut, 8 million people were ensnared in the alternative minimum tax. We lowered that number from probably, by the way, most of you probably never even have heard of the alternative minimum tax in the last 4 years. You know why? Because only 400,000 people today have to pay the alternative minimum tax. And for those of you who don't know what it is, you'd have to fill out one massive tax form, and then you'd have to fill out another one, and you'd have to pay the liability, which was ever the greater. So we're going to have to bring that back if we get rid of the Trump tax cut. And the other thing we did, and look, I'm a big believer that death should not be a taxable event, and we did reduce the number of people who had to pay am I done? No. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. We cut by about 2/3 the number of people who had to pay the death tax. So on balance, I think it was a positive thing. I'm all in favor of this idea of a commission. I like that idea. I think we could, look, I think we could cut $1 trillion of this budget. David and I could sit down in a half an hour and we could cut $1 trillion and people wouldn't even miss it. This is the abuse that's taken place in Washington, the fraud. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of money was stolen in COVID money. The Biden administration has put a $300 billion, not $300 million, $300 billion green energy slush fund. I think Kamala said she spent, we invested $1 trillion in green energy. What did you get for it? Prior to them coming into office, we got 83% of our energy from fossil fuels. Today, we get 83% of our energy from fossil fuels. There is no green energy transition. It just isn't happening. And so I think we can find the ways to cut waste, grow the economy, and get on a more sane fiscal path. And I'll stop there. Thank you.